in my capacity as a journalist, from New York City, I have written about Andrew Cuomo since I want to say 2012 now, so about 8 years. So since his first term, and I followed him pretty closely. I've written a lot about New York City politics and state politics, and he just to give a primer. He very much has been a fiscally conservative, socially liberal governor. That's probably the easiest way to describe him, though at times he has pivoted to the left, usually when it's convenient for him or if he's experiencing some type of pressure from left-leaning forces in New York State. So I won't, I have political issues with Cuomo, but I'll focus mostly on coronavirus. And back in March, I started, writing about COVID, like everyone else, as it was ravaging New York City. And one of my great frustrations at the time, and still a frustration, was how Andrew Cuomo would get constantly praised for his response to coronavirus, which is still the case. And I argued at the time, and I still argue. I also argue in the Substack, as you can see, which is called the Cuomo Files, and was started originally to hold Andrew Cuomo accountable. It's still doing that, but then I also pivot to other topics as well, like Bernie Sanders and Tucker Carlson. So,
which Cuomo piece should we open, by the way?
It's a good question. I would say you can go to. You can go from the why does the media, welcome to the Cuomo Files, kind of the overview. Why does the media take the onus off Cuomo? Was one that I enjoyed writing because it was a good encapsulation of the ways the media really let Cuomo off the hook. So just to give a quick recap, why do I criticize Cuomo, who has been valorized in all sorts of media, from the New York Times to, prestige national magazines, you name a media outlet, Cuomo has gotten praise from it. Why has he been praised, and why do I think he's failed? Well, we start with the fact that, New York State lost a phenomenal amount of life. I think we still, even now with coronavirus killing a lot of people across the country, we don't really, I don't think, reckon enough with how many people died who did not have to die. 32,000 people statewide. It's a staggering number. New York City, well over 20,000. And it was pretty apparent by the beginning of March that coronavirus was spreading in New York City, New York State. If you'd read about it, if you'd followed, how the virus interacts, the trajectory of it was very clear this is going to be a major problem. And instead of addressing it, both Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo repeatedly downplayed the threat. You can go back and look at clips from early March interviews where Cuomo was talking about how he still wanted to shake people's hands. He was saying things like the fear is the greatest thing that you have to fear about this, kind of like FDR,
right. Except FDR was not talking about disease.
Let's not overreact.
Right.
And then he was very slow, actually, despite his reputation, to shut down the city. And that's really what it comes down to. In California, Gavin Newsom and London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, really coordinated together to do a relatively early shutdown. Even Bill de Blasio on March 17th was saying it's time to shut down New York City. We need a shelter-in-place order. Cuomo dismissed it wholesale, mostly because Bill de Blasio had suggested it.
Right,
Cuomo
they're so annoying, their little rivalry.
Yes. And Cuomo also was late to order a statewide shutdown of schools. The states of Ohio and Michigan actually were quicker to do this than Andrew Cuomo. So he was late on a shutdown order. We didn't get the statewide shutdown order until March 22nd. By then, the virus had spread rapidly throughout the city and the state as well, and people were getting sick and dying. So he was slow on that front in his initial reaction to contain the spread. He was very bad at coordinating with New York City, coordinating hospitals, the public hospitals, the private hospitals. Some hospitals were horribly overrun with cases. Others were not. You had an issue of hospital capacity in certain neighborhoods. Ironically, in part, that's because Andrew Cuomo has supported defunding hospitals, cutting Medicaid funding, especially to poor hospitals. You had a situation where actually the city and state were quite disorganized, and there was a lot of needless suffering and death. And we've done a good job of bending and flattening the curve. I do give Andrew Cuomo credit there, but people are still dead. And then you look at the nursing homes, which are also a catastrophe. At least 6,000 people are dead and died in New York State nursing homes. I say at least because we do not know the true number. The way nursing home deaths are counted in New York is if you get sick and infected in a nursing home, but you die in a hospital, it is a hospital death and not a nursing home death.
Oh, wow.
You can imagine.
But
someone gets sick in a nursing home, they are then transported logically to a hospital. And so in this calculus, those deaths don't even count. So you just 6,000 people who got sick and died in nursing homes literally died there. You have many more people died in hospitals. And that count is very unclear. There's been a very much publicized, directive that Cuomo really admitted was a failed policy and repealed back in May, which was nursing homes had to accept and readmit COVID positive patients. And this isn't the only reason that many people died in nursing homes, but it certainly is a contributing factor. Cuomo also gave nursing homes and hospitals legal immunity in the state budget, which is very important to keep in mind. I'm doing a piece on for the Nation right now in nursing homes. I'm speaking with families of those who suffered. It's very, very sad. And they cannot bring a COVID-related lawsuit against the nursing home for malpractice. They are forbidden by law. Nursing homes.
We had on David Sirota to talk about that.
Sirota's been very, very good on that.
So gross. And that's because his donors are people who run these nursing homes?
Yeah, the nursing home industry is very powerful in New York State. So is the hospital industry as well. Cuomo works very closely with the power brokers in the healthcare sector. He has for a long time. And you had individual nursing homes, too, who are begging for PPE. Please give us, we don't have enough. And the state failed to give them enough PPE. And that was another major issue. And there were just also, and go on and on about this, logistical issues, Cuomo purchasing and trying to get as many ventilators as he could while ignoring cries for PPE. And PPE was relatively affordable and available compared to ventilators, but he chose to focus on ventilators rather than those preventative measures. So, while you can give the state credit for flattening the curve, you can't ignore the staggering amount of death. And then finally, the economic reaction to coronavirus in New York is also very concerning because Andrew Cuomo has proposed deep cuts to state aid that he is currently basically following through on. He has not detailed them yet, but City University of New York, the State University of New York, a lot of public institutions are cutting back rapidly, laying people off under the assumption that the state is not going to give them any money. Now, tax revenue has plummeted in New York State as it has elsewhere. And the question is, what do you do, right? You can raise taxes on wealthy people. This has been done many times before. After 9/11, we raised money on wealthy people, on property owners. Did it during the Great Recession after 2008. Cuomo right now is refusing to back any sort of tax on millionaires and billionaires, which is a big, big issue. And he's also refusing to borrow money. The Federal Reserve has virtually interest-free loans that they are offering to municipalities. Cuomo has been reluctant to raise taxes or borrow. So what do you do? If you're not going to raise taxes, you're not going to borrow, Donald Trump is not coming through the generous federal aid package, at least not yet, you cut. And so Cuomo has always been very driven by this austerity mindset.
Right.
If he hasn't always successfully implemented it on every level, it's always been kind of a grand aim of his. And for those who live in New York now, that is the deep concern. You're going to see devastating cuts to public schools, to public transportation, to hospitals, to social services, to the very safety net that we all rely on. And it's deeply distressing, and I've written a fair amount about it in my newsletter for The Nation and elsewhere. So that's kind of the over.
I've had on Ava Farkas, who's the executive director of Met Council on Housing. Also, I've known her since I was 5. Good friend. And she was talking about how Cuomo, he makes it seem like he has, like, his hands are tied. But he doesn't have, just like that he said, he can't expand the budget beyond like 2% or something. It's this random number.
The property tax.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, right.
He will not. Yes, he imposes a cap on how much you can raise property taxes. And that's how most local governments fund everything outside of New York City, especially. So, yeah, it ties the hands of public education in particular. It's a big issue.
And then, and he's a fiscal conservative. He's an austerity governor. But the other thing is, like, as most people know, that's always been basically a myth. You can performatively be socially, and I guess with LGBTQ stuff, it's different. Well, yeah. Anyway, but
he's been good on that.
Yeah, he's been
coaching on that for 9 years now.
And I am, I'm Black, I'm a Jew, I'm a gay. You remember that video that he did?
I remember that very well.
That was really moving. You can only do fiscal conservatism and austerity so much before you're actually implementing racist policies, just because of how.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, housing is a great example. I'm sure Ava talked a lot about that. New York for decades now has been losing hundreds of thousands of rent stabilized apartments, and it was only in 2019 that a law was repealed that you couldn't make a rent stabilized apartment a market rate apartment. So just I guess to back up for those who don't know, New York City, most apartments are market rate, like condos, regular, rentals. They can charge whatever they want, whatever the market bears. But we do have, which is kind of a remnant of our post-World War II social safety net, which has been steadily eroded, this program of rent stabilized housing. And a fair amount of people, I've lived in rent stabilized housing, a fair amount of people do. Rent stabilized housing doesn't mean that you still don't pay pretty high rent. What it means is the landlord is limited every year in how much they can raise your rent. And that is set by a rent guidelines board. So usually it's 1 or 2% a year. You have a right to renewal. You have all these little protections built in that the market rate renter does not get. And in the 1990s, a law was passed in Albany and in the city council as well that created a way for landlords to raise rents to a certain level so they can then deregulate rent stabilized housing and make it market rate. The threshold was, it changed over the years, $2,000 something. You would hit that rent, it would go market rate. Landlords had a variety of tricks they could pull, doing capital improvements, harassing tenants to either get them to move. If they left the apartment, if it went vacant, you could take it market rate, or you could raise the rent enough. So landlords had a lot of ways to make sure these rent stabilized apartments became expensive market rate apartments. And so this bad 1990s law was only repealed when Democrats took control of the state Senate, no thanks to Andrew Cuomo, in 2018, then took office in 2019 and repealed this. And so Cuomo had almost a decade as governor where he did nothing to protect the rent stabilized apartment stock. He did nothing to strengthen rent laws in New York State. So if you are a tenant, a renter, a working class person in New York City or New York State, you quite frankly should have a lot of problems with Andrew Cuomo. If you're a wealthy person, maybe not. or
Right.
you know, maybe you're a wealthy person who cares about those who aren't as well off as you. But from a housing standpoint, and really from, you know, from a really a standpoint of the social safety net and the public sector, Cuomo has been either a real roadblock to progress, or someone who's not doing enough to further the cause. And it kind of depends on the year and his mood.